who this is for, so.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Tastes good.
This is. We need that.
Good evening and welcome to the Kent School Board Policy Work Session. It's 5 o'clock and we're holding this in public to comply with the Open Public Meetings Act. The purpose of this meeting is a policy work session with Ms. Pam Holly. I am going to have to call the roll, so Director Bento.
Present.
Director Hamada.
Present.
Vice President Farr.
Present.
And I assume we are anticipating an arrival of Director Margell.
It's coming,
Okay,
yeah.
and I'm present. All right. At this time then, I'm going to call upon the Superintendent Vela for introductions.
Thank you, President Clark, and members of the board. Again, excited to have our policy work session. As you know, we've been working hard as a board, and I'm not going to steal Ms. Holly's thunder because she's going to start off today with really how well we've been doing as a board with our policies. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Ms. Holly up to the podium to kick off our policy work session.
And I want to acknowledge that Director Margell is now present.
Thank you.
Hi. Good evening, President Clark, members of the board, Superintendent Vela, Ms. Antello, Ms. Curry. Tonight we'll do kind of the same format where we kind of rip through the PowerPoint because you have one in front of you. So just give an overview. The first thing I want to talk about, though, is our policy approval rate, which is phenomenal. We are making so much progress, it's actually unbelievable. This policy work session is the 5th that we've had. We've, since June of 2022, the board approved the update or addition of 14 policies in the 5 policy work sessions that were scheduled. But just as a reminder, we didn't have one on November 30th. It was canceled due to inclement weather, so we're making quite a bit of progress. Since August 2021, 30 policies have moved to approval, which is great. So we'll go through the PowerPoint rather quickly. Classifications, again, we just point this out every time so the public's aware of the 3 different policy classifications. That policies the board's work, procedures the staff's work. We're going to start with 6220, bidder request for proposal requirements. It's a first reading. 3143, notification and dissemination of information about student offenses and notification of threats of violence or harm. First reading. It's a good thing there were no more words to that title. 3144, release of information concerning student sexual and kidnapping offenders. That is going to be retired. 4314, notification of threats of violence or harm, also to be retired. 3225, school-based threat assessment. This is a first reading, and it's a policy that's new to KSD. 3241, student discipline, first reading. 1220, board officers and duties of board members. This is a second reading. 4220, complaints concerning staff or programs, third reading. 5271, reporting improper governmental action, which is whistleblower protection. That's our fourth reading. If any policies are moving forward, they will appear on the March 22nd regular meeting agenda. The tentative next policy work session is March 15th. Okay, so we'll start with 6220. This is update to KSD bid or request for proposal. And there were some comments from Director Hamada about this policy. And so I'll just note those. To start off with, WASDA revised this policy to add language providing for conducting a cost-price analysis. The revisions address interlocal cooperative agreements, which we have in the district. We are not a self-certification district at this point in time, although that's noted in the policy. Please note that the exemptions to the requirements are clearly and legitimately limited to a single source supply. This is for getting bids. We can be under $40,000 without a bid. $40,000 to $75,000 is competitive bidding process where it's just a telephone call or something in writing that needs to be noted. And then anything that's 100,000 or more has to, the board has to follow a formal competitive bidding process. Director Hamada had questions about state funds versus non-federal funds, and non-federal funds are anything that are state apportionment, levy, or any local revenue like taxes.
Okay, that includes all those then, yeah.
I'm sorry?
That's the category I was asking for, all
Right.
the ones that, can you state that again, please? So
Sure.
I have it in my mind clearly.
Sure, non-federal funds are state apportionment, levy, and any local revenue such as taxes.
Okay, thank you.
Have any questions?
I have a question, tangential to this, because I know Highline just passed something about community workforce agreements. I know Seattle has something similar, and that's not what this is about, but it's part of that process of with community workforce agreements is working with agencies in your local community to have people who work in the community, live in the community, be the people that we call upon for bids and whatnot. And I'm just curious, like, and I don't know who can answer this, so I'm putting it out in the world, because I know, just because I saw Highline passed it recently, and I was like, wow, that would be good for the community, not get someone from out of state or whatnot. So I just had some questions about that and how that would connect with this.
Yeah, no, thank you, Director Beno. Actually, I have the question myself. So, let's just make sure that so we'll work together here on this language. So, this one is specifically stating for the tax dollars, levy dollars, state and non-federal. So, to me, all of that means anything that's been comes to us in terms of funding from either from a tax perspective, a levy, which is taxed, and also any apportionments that we might receive from the state.
Yeah.
When we start talking about other funds related to this bid proposal and the 100,000, I'm thinking the question, and correct me if I'm wrong, is would this proposal, this policy still be something that we would take to a bid if it is an outside community-based partner that would be offering, if we put an RFI or RFP out?
Yeah.
Right? That's kind of am I in the right?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, yes.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
for that one, I think I'm going to go with our Associate Superintendent of Finance. Let's go right to the.
And we may not have the
Might
answer
be able to
tonight,
help
but if he does, that'd be
Yeah,
amazing.
no, great.
I would love more research on
Or
that
even
too.
Sarah, yeah.
Yeah, Sarah's gonna
We'll
join
start,
me up
yeah.
here.
Defer if you need, and that, there you go.
Yeah, so I'll make a brief introductory comment, and then I will yield to the brains of the operation here. Miss-
I love it.
So it is a little confusing as we spent a lot of time reviewing this, and part of the way that this is structured is there's all these slices about the different types of funds that you use for the purchase, right? And it gets a little confusing.
Yep.
The only real reason for that is frankly that the federal law is fairly intricate in terms of the limitations that we have anytime we spend $1 of federal money. So you'll see all sorts of situations where there's certain parts of this that apply to all funds, then there's certain carve-outs where only certain things apply to federal funds, and so that's why it's a little hard to track, but it is that way on purpose. It has to be that way, in other words. So, in terms of your specific question, are you able to reflect on Member Benton? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Director Bento, for the question. So for any of our community-based partnerships, and so the policy you're referring to at Highline, I would love to go dive in deep. I actually had a great conversation with them earlier this week about just their procurement and how they use interlocal. So, for example, we currently, just last year, actually under the direction of Sherry Simpson, we just went out for an RFP for all of our tutoring and social emotional support. So for any of our community-based partnership organizations that we need to partner with over 75,000, we would go ahead and do a public process for that. That's all listed here within this current policy. So it is related, but again, would love to look at that policy that Highland has.
And
they
yeah,
just
that would be
passed.
my question too, is like how like the specific CWA, the Community Workforce Agreements, how they work and how it's connected with this policy. I'm not sure if it's this exact policy. I thought the number was the same, but who knows? But I'd be very curious about that too, so.
Absolutely, thank you.
Okay,
Yes,
thank
I
you,
will do
yeah.
some research, appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Sarah or anything else about this policy?
I have a question in general, because a while ago, I used to do government contracts for a company I work for, which got to be quite complex. But I'm curious, a lot of times when we're taking in bids, where does it say, or what policy can I find under it that when they're making these bids, the specs have to line up? You can't just use a lower grade to win a contract. I mean, how do we oversee that process? I mean, I'm talking about specifics like,
Again, so I understand the question. It's when you say specs, I'm going to assume, but I don't want to, but I'm going to. The way I'm taking that is there may be either code requirements or related to a certain bid. Is that what you're getting at? In other words, whoever is making the bid must meet these requirements in terms of standards
yeah.
for making that bid.
A lot of times I won contracts because of the quality of, that our company offered to them as opposed to the other bids that were higher. But they could get around that because of the specs were superior with our products. I
Yeah,
mean, do we
that-
have, how is that determined in all these bids? I'm just curious.
So-
I mean, do we have some
So I'll-
oversees all that, or?
I think I'm going to, again, have Mr. Eric kind of address that one, and yeah, start there.
I will offer some general comments, and then I will defer to my colleague here. Yeah, so it isn't merely the person who specifies the lowest bid. Obviously, it has to be responsive to all of the provisions of the RFP or RFI or whatever it is that we put before. So there, I think, and Mr. Buzzard would be a great person to respond to this particular
Yeah, I
question
wish
because
he
he
was
deals
here
with it
now.
all the time, right? It's less frequent in the general fund, but certainly you can have a situation where a vendor responds to a proposal, they're the lowest bid, but it's not a qualified responsive bid to the parameters that were put in the request for proposal, and so they don't win. So being the lowest is not being the most responsive or the winner in that case. If you wanted a more detailed answer, Ms. Dumlau could talk you in circles on this, but that's the high level of it.
And the dollar amount, like, when you're saying furniture overall, I'm thinking about buying, we have a bond that we might purchase if it goes through, all kinds of furniture. Can we, as an organization, play with those numbers?
What does
Like, could
play
you-
with them mean?
Could you go under 75 with one company and over, or is there any guidelines on that?
Can you clarify the question one more time, please?
They were buying furniture for a whole district. You could go to different companies and break it up for the dollar amount to be different, or you could do it as a whole. I mean, how do we look at that, something like that? I mean, it's not always about dollar amount, is it, or is it?
Yeah, I can say for certain that we can't break up a purchase merely for the purpose of evading a bid threshold. So if the purpose of the bid has a conceptual focus, right? There are situations where maybe throughout one year, we buy furniture for one school, and then later, there's furniture for another school, and then later, and those might be separate bids legitimately, because you're not necessarily buying for a single purpose. So we have to be very, very careful of that, because that's actually one of the first things that they audit, is they look to see.
I was just curious how
Yeah.
school districts did it.
Yeah, so they'll look to see, is there any evidence whatsoever that purchase orders were sort of disaggregated merely for the purpose?
Okay, thank
Yeah,
you.
that's like screen one. So we err on the side of even if there's even the appearance of that, avoiding it.
I appreciate that. That's just what I kind of in general wanted
Yeah.
to.
Thank you, Mr. Rarick.
I just wanted to, when I was reading this policy, one of the things that came to my mind is, yes, you know, the bids go out and to companies that, especially when it comes to construction, companies that we know their work and we're familiar. But the other side of that is those companies are companies owned by white people who have gone through the process of learning how this works, but does not give chance to small minority-owned companies. And I want to make sure that we are putting that into practice to make sure that the dollar amount that comes from the taxpayer is spread through equity lens, so that we are also bringing up small women minority-owned companies that would bid in the projects that the Kent School District does for the community. So therefore, we're also building those companies for future, so that they will be the go-to company that we will go for buying furniture, for example, building, and what have you. So that's one of the things that I was looking at that and wanted to also, it's not a, I don't know how we can make that as a policy.
It's actually in this policy, Vice President Farah, that we will do our best. You can see number 3 here under the competitive bid process. Take steps whenever possible to ensure minority-owned business, women-owned business.
And I feel like that's a lot of what this community workforce agreement thing that
Right,
Highline
exactly.
did
That's-
had
yeah,
that
that's-
too. But theirs was so different, so I was trying to find it, I can't Google and find it, but like it was very similar to that. So like, how do you ensure that while also meeting the law requirements of
Right,
bidding
right.
and whatnot? So that, I feel like this is really complex. So I want to,
It is a complex, because you have company that provided good service for us for over the years, and we know what they're doing, how they do things. There's no guessing, there's no worrying of what can happen, all of that. Then again, we get comfortable and keeping that role going. So I just want us to challenge ourselves to make sure that.
And I think too, it would be just in general, which I hear that looking at that policy, making it more defined, and I've heard that from people too, that there are school districts that have now started to get on that to make it more defined. So I'd be anxious, not with this policy, but with, looking down the road in the future. I hear you, Director Farah.
And our procedure could reflect that.
Right.
That's what
sure.
I was going to say. I mean, we
Yeah.
can,
Right.
Yeah.
we can state it as a policy, and this is our directive.
Right.
Yeah,
And then
that's good.
how it's
It's done. It's
done is really up to administration to
Absolutely.
enact.
Right.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the conversation on the board, and Vice President Farah, as Holly just pointed out.
Right.
The broad piece
Right.
as it relates to the process by which bid acceptance is done according to the policy, is I think what you're getting at it is, are we doing this in a way that it's exposure?
Right.
It's the bid process is not being withheld in any way, whether it be how we're going about going out for bid. And I think I would like to have my team really take a look at that, so that to see, is there alignment in this in any way? However, back to this policy, the way it's written, it looks like that, I'll turn it back over to Ms. Hawley to finish out what WASA policy is and what if there's any other questions, but I think I would like to follow up with that language from the boards.
And I know Ms. Dumlau has worked on this quite extensively with Mr. Rarick, and I'm sure the procedure would match everything that's in here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We good to move on?
Yes.
Okay.
Before, sorry, one
sure.
just thing. The idea of posting in newspapers seems super antiquated. Is this just like because we have to?
Well, it's required.
That is a requirement, okay.
It is.
But
Don't get me wrong, I love newspaper and I still have it delivered to my house every day, but I think I'm in a growing minority on this
I will
one.
tell you that I know Sarah's worked on this too, and I dealt with a lot of RFPs. It's required, and we submit electronically, but it still goes into a print newspaper.
Okay, and that's, I guess, was more of my question is, I assume that there's
Yes.
closer to the century means by which we also are posting this, not just newspaper.
And I should say, print newspaper, but electronic version that many people are reading. It's in that way.
Yes,
Digital format.
I love our newspapers.
And I would like to say, Director Margill, that I think I've shared with the board that I do like the newspaper. I
Very much
read
love
it
the
every
newspaper.
morning.
Yes.
And, but definitely point taken in that the digital version and aspects, and goes back to the bid process and that, where are we doing that? So it's there's exposure out to all of our bidders, potential bidders.
Yes.
Okay, we'll move on to policy 3143, notification and dissemination of information about student offenses and notification of threats of violence or harm. This is again first reading. During the past 2 decades, the legislature's passed several bills that required courts, state agencies, and county sheriffs to notify schools and districts of student criminal offenses. Another component of legislative action was noting how districts and school principals appropriately disseminate the sensitive but potentially crucial information about the students. And I want to note that the content from 3144, release of information concerning student sexual and kidnapping, and 4314, notification of threats of violence or harm, have been merged into this policy. So we'll be retiring 2 policies and putting that language into this one. Any questions? Have a consensus to move on?
I have a question in general, because when you receive that information, and I understand why it's private information for the superintendent or the designee or the principal, is any of that information given to our teachers that have these kids in their classrooms at all? So they would be aware maybe of what's going on with the student?
Yeah, I think we have someone here that can maybe speak to that.
Sherry and I are here tag teaming on this.
Where's that?
Meeting President Clark, members of the board, Superintendent Vela, Ms. Santello. There actually, in that policy, is language that pertains to who gets notified when and what that level of notification is. One of those areas is particularly in that sex offender notification.
Could we have you step into the mic?
Sorry.
Thank you.
Particularly the level 1 and 2s, that gets a different notification than the level 3s. So that's disseminated based on what the factors are of the notification. So that is laid out in the policy.
Okay, I apologize. I didn't get, this is the one policy I didn't get to, but thank you.
And there's a lot to it.
Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Whitlow.
There further questions? Okay, thank you.
Okay, we'll move this one on if the board is good with that.
I just wanted to point out, President Clark, that I believe Ms. Howley referenced the retiring of 3144 and 4314 as part of this. Just a reminder.
Right, right.
May I ask, how that's voted on? Do we vote on the retirement, or do we just vote on the adoption of this?
Retirement will go in under discussion and approval,
Okay,
yes,
so it'll come up separately.
separately, right, but it will be voted on.
Okay, thank you.
Well, if I can, just for clarification, I mean, the whole point of retiring them is because the one that you're adopting has those encoded.
Correct, yeah. I just didn't know
Yeah.
if by just adopting that automatically
Correct.
retires the other ones because they're included? Or does that have to be voted on separately as procedural?
We've always put them in to be voted on before, retired policies, but board can look at doing things differently if they'd like to.
Thank you.
The next one is 3225, school-based threat assessment. The threat assessment is a preventative trauma-enforced process using early interventions to keep students safe and engaged in school. This policy is new to KSD, but Tim Kovich, our Assistant Director of Safety Services, told me that we have had the threat assessment in place since 2000. They chose the Salem-Kaiser Cascade Threat Assessment Model, which the state adopted after KSD did. Director Hamada had questions about how many threat assessment teams do we have. Every school has a threat assessment team, as well as a district threat assessment team. She wanted to have data, and we can provide data on how many times we've used this process.
Oh, really?
There is no list per se of the team members, but you can, I was told by Mr. Kovich that it's the principal, assistant principal, counselor out at the building, at the district office, administrators and safety services. And you ask about, I'm sorry, Director Hamada asked, is there extra pay for being on this team? And Tim let me know, and I checked with Susie as well, that it's normally takes place during the daytime. So it's just part of the job, basically.
Okay.
Any questions?
Appreciate that, thank you.
I just wanted to add, no, great question on that I've been really proud of this since 2000, as you heard, being part of this process. And a lot of it is dependent on the particular situation that develops on who would be on that. Sometimes it's outside folks that we enlist to provide support.
I saw that. Yeah.
And sometimes it's, more centralized around the specific school. Yeah, so it's really, it depends. So real proud of our team, as I said.
I have a question, and I think it would be hard to do this, but because you wouldn't want the students to know, but would we ever be able to have a student have a voice on that type of thing at all?
Well, as you know,
I mean, you can't,
as you know, it's dependent on the threat, and we protect the rights of
Yeah, I
those
get-
that either are a part of the threat. And unfortunately, some of it stems from social media, and so we also have to be sensitive to what information is already out there or not. And so, and I don't think that they would have a student may or may not have the background within the threat assessment team of what do we do next, right? What do we provide? But yeah, if it's a student, they're a part of it, they're part of the threat, but we wouldn't put a student as part of providing.
yeah, I don't know how you did it, but I mean, sometimes having our students who are leaders in our school make suggestions. I mean, but you have to keep that information private, but I'd like to,
Yep.
I get it. Just curious.
I think, I agree that student voice is so important in that and might uncover blind spots that we have as adults. The other thing kind of stemming off that is, I had questions around this group having any say in school design and/or
Say more about school design, structurally or
could be.
instructionally?
I was thinking structurally.
Okay.
One of the things that in visiting some of our schools was, do you feel safe here? We asked that,
Yeah.
and that was really important. I think it's at the very most fundamental level of human needs and the ability to learn. And so this seems like an appropriate team to involve in discussions of what do our schools look like? What do our teams look like? And so with student voice and really the experts that are kind of on the ground seeing this every day.
I believe it's a yes and for that one.
Sure.
Teams have safety teams, committees within schools that are continually advising around safety features around that. As it relates to threat assessment, it could be the threat assessment actually requires the need to be able to either address some of the exposure potentially, or make sure that we don't have any threat because of the structural setting where they are. And those settings are different depending on the threat. They're
Sure.
just so
This,
vast.
it's a very big,
Absolutely,
Yeah.
threat is a very big word,
Yeah.
right? It could encompass a lot.
Absolutely.
Sure.
I had a question. On my document that shows the strikeouts, there's a sentence, the very last sentence is struck out. It says, assessing individuals other than students whose behavior poses a threat to the safety of students or staff, and notify the superintendent or designee of such an individual. And that's crossed out. When I click the suggestions, it says I should just notify. So I'm just curious, like, why? Because there's not really a reason why it was deleted. Is that somewhere else? Is that?
Let me take a look and see.
Good question.
Because I would feel like that's something that the team does, but I'm just curious.
See, I think you made the strikeout. Maybe it's just included somewhere else in the policy.
Dr. Beno, which one are you?
The very last
Last
sentence.
Last one, okay.
Before the legal references.
Staff can notify. Sherry, I don't recall where that one is in there, but we can certainly take a look at that. And
It was the fact that it was individuals other than students where we would direct those towards law enforcement. And that's why I believe you set
yes,
that up.
right. It's
Yeah.
individuals that are not
And
students.
the
So this is
question that's posed
pertaining
right
to
now
stu-
is, why was it stricken, right?
Yeah, because I feel like that should be part of the policy, because like if I'm someone who doesn't know and I look at this, I'm like, oh, this doesn't tell me where, if there's someone besides a student, who do I go to, who do I tell? Like that doesn't show here.
And I think it goes back to the foundation of the threat assessment itself. The threat assessment is assessing a threat risk, not did somebody make a threat? So this piece is looking at individuals that aren't students. So if an individual that's not a student makes a threat, we have a process for that. That either is dealt with administration in the building handling that, going to law enforcement, but we wouldn't do a threat assessment on an individual who wasn't a student. We would only do that with a student. That's the threat assessment process.
I hear that, but where does that go? Like there has to be a policy, right? That talks about, we don't just randomly calling the police, we're not just randomly like, what's the policy that this would go under? Because if we're gonna delete it, it should be somewhere else, right? Otherwise, I guess that's.
What do we do?
What do we do with it?
Is that included in procedures somewhere?
Yeah, most likely, I think back to this is, the threat is not related, could be students, but it's not the student themselves.
That's-
Is what
right.
this
That
is
is the
stricken.
threat.
It is saying that when it is not, then you must inform wide vast of who that could be. It could be a threat assessment that includes law enforcement in this because it's an outside threat, or individual that's not a student. Might be a situation that might be taking place.
And I hear all that, but if I'm Googling the policies and I'm like, oh, threat assessment, and I'm looking to see, oh, that's not on here, like I would like to at least see a cross-reference or something. Like I know this is under the students, the 3200 is a student series, but it doesn't really tell us, like we're just deleting it, but I just feel weird that's not going in there, we're just striking it, which I feel weird about.
And we can find out where that's cross-referenced. There may be something in lockdowns in the school safety policies piece in terms of how do we handle threats that come into our schools, and most likely it's under that section.
Find it, cross-reference it.
Okay.
Okay? Anybody else?
Thank you.
All right.
So Director Beno, we can check on that and find out where that's included.
Can we hold off on moving this until we figure out? where that goes.
If I may, I do see policy 4210, 4310, and 4314.
Yeah, I saw that too.
Possession of weapons on school premises, emergencies was under students, district relations with law enforcement and other government agencies, and notification of threats of violence or harm.
Which we're going to be striking.
But I don't know which one
Yeah.
that's under.
Yeah, and I can't click these to see them, so that's making it challenging. I would like to be a little bit more informed before I move forward with this one.
So if we can get you that information, I want to know if there's a consensus to move it or a consensus to hold. What are we going to do?
Well, Joe has expressed it correctly. He's seeking clarification of specific language. So if in fact you can find language that meets that, and it's simply in the cross-reference thing, all I'm suggesting is send us the page where the cross-reference identifies how we deal with threats.
Non-student threats.
Well, that's-
Yeah.
So I'll ask Director Bennett, would that suffice in,
Yes, because then we'd vote on this at our next meeting, right? So as long as we can
Yeah.
get it beforehand, then I would feel better about that.
Okay.
We'll get you that information.
thank you.
Okay. Next one we're moving on to is 1220, board officers and duties of board members. Let me pull it up.
That's not the order I had. You went from 325 and then you listed on.
Oh, I'm sorry, 3241.
3241.
Sorry, thank you. Sherry's like, what, are you skipping me? Okay, so revisions to state law require districts to use proactive instructional and restorative approaches to behavior while keeping students in the classroom to the maximum extent possible. Questions?
I did submit change to this, I don't know if you saw it.
I did not see it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I can pull yours up, though. Oh, I can't, I'm sorry, I can't pull yours up, but can you recap what you?
Well, what I wanted to, if you, student discipline, go down. Where it says, see, the district observes student fundamental rights, right? And administer discipline in a manner that does not, right? And then the first one, it says unlawful discrimination. And then what I added was another one that says it is unlawful not to allow due process for a student on the basis of sex, race, creed, religion, national origin.
So your addition was to add
Right, I
due
want to make sure
process?
due process in that.
And I'm not sure.
Where is that exactly, Wally? Is
The
that on
dis-
number one?
No, I
Under
just
rights
added
and responsibilities,
here.
district
Oh, okay.
commitment. I have it up here, it's right where the cursor is.
The cursor.
I'm sorry, my
can't
eyes
see the
cannot go
cursor.
that far.
Number one, unlawfully
The first
discriminate
one, the
against.
number one,
Yep, there we go.
Yeah.
Sorry, I can sit on my screen.
And what are we adding?
due process.
After what? Which word?
Because it says it's unlawful to discriminate against, right? But then I want to add, it's unlawful to not allow due process.
No, I gotta tell you, I get nervous on that.
Okay, let's talk about it.
All right. So let me give another approach, and I'm gonna drop down to number 3. The district will observe fundamental rights and will administer discipline in a manner that does not deprive a student of the student's constitutional right to be secure in the student's person, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. Now, as a former government teacher, I have to tell you, there is no such thing as an unrestricted right. And so when you hear, for instance, freedom of religion, It does not imply that there are not restrictions on freedom of religion. So I'm quite certain that there are some that would like to return to human sacrifice, but the reality is that's not on the table. And the reason it's not is because there are restrictions on what are constitutional rights. Now, those traditionally are simply curbed by Supreme Court rulings because they get down to the very narrow bone of where you're going. Unfortunately, though, when you get into students' rights, you start to bump into things like Tinker versus Des Moines and some of those cases where it's about, it would on the surface appear to be freedom of speech. I want to be critical of, but there has always been the restriction where you endanger students, whether you're exposing, they run a newspaper article that accuses someone of doing something outrageous. Not that any newspaper would do that, but when they do that, there should in fact be, you don't get to hide behind freedom of speech or freedom of the press to do that. So you want to be really careful about when you throw in that due process, you suddenly are restricting a principal who is trying to move quickly to immediately protect another student's right. So while I appreciate what you're saying, we need to know that students are protected. The reality is when you throw that in, no restriction on due process, you're actually handcuffing a principal that may be dealing with a live situation. And that's where I would.
I also want to point out, number 5 does talk about the district will not deprive a student of the student's right to an equal educational opportunity in whole or in part by a school district without due process of law.
Number 5?
Well, that
Doesn't say it.
That's,
yes,
Different, but not withholding education without
Yeah.
due process.
well, yeah, but the short version on that is you just expelled them. And I don't think that was the intent at all. I mean,
Right.
I agree with the statement as it reads. I'm troubled by the insertion of what,
And let me give you my thinking of it.
yeah, let's hear what your reasoning is.
Thank you. So that's why I added in there. The reason why I added in there is that I want to make sure that, as you indicated, principals are also human beings. They make mistakes. So therefore, by going with the fact that they will decide how a student is disciplined with a matter of seconds, deprives the student's ability to have a way of understanding how the decision was made. And let me give you multiple other scenarios.
Yep.
I can tell you, and this is only not district that we are. In every data you look, kids of color are disproportionately disciplined. Therefore, we really have to be very careful of the words that we put on the policies that we're going to implement that will make sure that and I'm not saying that the principals or the teachers are not unaware of what are the things but we all have biases. And I want to make sure those ones that are making decision to discipline or expel a student are checking every possible way and making sure that child has that due process ability to make sure that every way possible is checked.
all right, and I have a question for our law officer. Mr. Brockvogel, if you would, if I'm not mistaken, isn't that the very purpose of an appeal?
To confirm there was due process?
Yep.
That's one of them, yes. That would be the procedural safeguards and due process on the appellate level, right. So you look back and you find out whether there was an error in the due process. But recall that you're only required to provide the process that's actually due. So it may not be under every circumstance the same. It may not be an exhaustive right to cross-examination or this and that. So it depends on the circumstances.
Director Farah?
Yes.
Can you help me understand what that term means to you by adding it?
It means that the way of making sure that we're implementing a discipline to a student has now one layer, it has multiple layers. It has multiple people that are involved and making sure that before it gets to a discipline, there is a process that the school follows to make sure that the child has gotten every opportunity not to reach to that level. So that's what I mean by
There's a statement that's being added that's implementing culturally responsive discipline that provides every student the opportunity to achieve personal and academic success, because that's what it sounds like you're saying.
Right.
And I feel like that's the newly added thing that's being added to this.
Yeah, I appreciate
Right.
I've had conversations with
Right.
each of the board related to discipline. The intent of this, just to kind of walk us back.
Right.
It is under rights and responsibilities and our commitment as a district. And the intent of this one is, because I do know and I understand what Vice President Farah is getting at here. The intent of this bullet, though, it really is around discrimination based on the pieces that you see.
Right.
That's the basis of that. But I also hear Vice President Farah saying, so that all of us as a board really, it is, are there any other rights that a student of color would have as it relates to being disciplined disproportionately? And I heard you say that, and I'd like Mr. Heath to come to the podium to kind of talk a little bit of the difference between those, right? We have a federally mandated discrimination policy
Absolutely.
that also has law. And so,
The law, yeah.
but you have board policy prohibiting that, and that's what this statement is.
Right.
Now, going deeper into that, what other rights do our students have, and are those being followed to make sure that disproportionality is not occurring? So, Mr. Heath.
So, President Clark, members of the board, Superintendent Vela. So yes, this was a huge part of the topic of when they were revising the discipline codes in the state of Washington. A number of years ago, I attended public sessions where people were talking at the state level around what was behind the changes and what intent they were trying to do. And they added a whole bunch of requirements, really laying out the due process when you are looking at denying students an education through suspension, expulsions, those types of scenarios. And so the procedure actually is quite clear on the steps and the safeguards that are in place when a school is considering suspending a student. So back in the day, President Clark is correct. When I first started as an administrator, sometimes you were making as a principal a snap decision. You know, you come across a situation, you're suspended, you're out of here, and you call the parents and they're gone. It doesn't happen that fast anymore. There is a process where parents are invited in, and multiple attempts are made to try to get the parents in to be part of that discussion, a kind of mini informal hearing. It's not a formal hearing, but it's an informal piece with the parent hopefully involved as well, really for the student to say their side of the story, make sure that we've heard both sides. And in the suspension paperwork itself, there's a spot about what are the other choices that you considered for a disciplinary action before going to a suspension. So it actually steps back and makes the administrator identify, well, I thought about doing this or I thought about doing this as a piece. And then there's, of course, the appeal process that you have for each of these disciplinary pieces. But in addition to that, there are other safeguards in terms of the civil rights side of it. There's the non-discrimination policy that we have that we've tried to make more clear, real clear on our website around how you do that. We direct people to look it over and understand their rights around how they do this. But in addition to that, the big thing that recently has come out is that we are required as part of our CPR requirements to each year, each school needs to do an analysis of their disproportionality of their discipline. And when they identify the groups that may be disproportionately being disciplined, then they must come up with an action plan that is documented around how they're planning to address that and do a monitoring of that throughout the year and then see if they're making progress. And that's a yearly process that not only the district goes through, but each individual school. It used to just be like at a district level. Right. In recent changes to the law, it really came down to each school must individually do this and identify the groups at their school that are disproportionately being impacted. So there are a number of safeguards along the way that I think get to the heart of what you're hoping to get in that, adding that language there.
Mr. Heath, could you please, for our board, the acronym CPR?
Oh, sorry.
I thought this. This is CPR.
The consolidated program review, which is basically, there's this checklist of things that each school goes through that make sure that we're in compliance.
Acronyms are like...
I know, education.
Mr. Heath, could I ask a question about that self-assessment?
Yes.
Do we specify the groups by which we want identified for if there's potential in, if we just say it's by gender and race, well, what about kids with disabilities compared to kids without disabilities? What about kids? There's so many different segments by which, who specifies which groups we want them identified?
Yeah, no, it is clear on which ones that we have to do. It is by race, it is by the gender, it is by disability status, it is by
It's listed in the policy a little bit further down.
Okay, so we give it to them and, yes,
Right,
okay,
right.
thank you.
Yeah, it's prescribed to us by the state.
That's what I.
So, Randy, just a question. You mentioned all of the safeguards. Are they mentioned anywhere? Is it a policy or is this the procedural?
The real clear, like on each of the suspension, that is in the procedure.
It is in the procedure, but what you said also was that every school has to do, is it in the policy?
Is it down?
Is
Is
it
it
down
in the
here?
policy or is it in the procedure? Do you remember?
Is it in the procedure?
Hearings and stuff.
No, the one about the annual review of the.
It's right there.
Yeah, I think just,
Oh,
right there.
CPR.
It doesn't mention CPR.
Okay.
See, just so,
Right.
not the, it is consolidated program review. It is a state process that Renton School, every school district, actually, I take that back. Yes, but in different ways. Larger school districts in the past used to have to go through every single program.
Okay.
And what it does, it simply says, are you now following the law as it relates to discrimination or whatever that might be? So that actually will do that. And so, I just wanted to be clear that that's what they're looking at, is that procedure.
May I ask a clarifying question about the policy in general? As I'm looking at this under rights and responsibilities, the first two bullet points look like they're specifically talking about expulsionary discipline. And then the next section talks about a student's fundamental rights in general about all discipline, right? So.
trying to find this slide. I'm sorry.
It's under rights.
So I have a question on this one. I have, and I think about this as a parent that has kids that sometimes might not like all of the discipline that I do, and I have them give me the why back and, these questions. So due process, so if a kid, discipline, they get like detention after school, or I don't know if they still do this in lunches, we used to have to clean the tables. I might have just aged myself, I don't know if that still happens anymore.
They call it child labor.
I
wanna get
don't know,
sued.
but there's progressive discipline, right? And we're talking some of the lowest
Right.
levels of this one. Maybe you don't get to go to an assembly or something like that. Do students have the right to ask for a due process in something as simple as you have, you have detention?
They don't have, as far as I know.
It is not as spelled out as it is when you are looking at suspending a student from school and not being able to access their education. There is a level of appeal for every level of disciplinary action, and it follows under other, it's kind of really spelled out for the suspensions, but then there is and all other disciplinary, this is the appeal process and such.
I guess that's what I don't see here, and maybe I'm just missing it, so please show it to me where I'm missing this, is it seems like this is attributed to all disciplinary actions, and what I don't want to do is handcuff our school teachers and administrators from being able to say, hey, that was inappropriate behavior, you're missing out at this next assembly because you can't seem to keep your hands to yourself and you're pulling Jane's hair, whatever it is, right? I want due process before that happens. And you can't, because the assembly's next.
It depends, yeah.
Do you know where I'm going on this one? I think I'm
yeah,
giving a
well,
very specific example, but I'm
Yeah.
hoping that could be extrapolated.
At the top of this is exclusionary.
Okay.
That's a different type of a discipline. So when you're excluding, this is what I think that Mr. Heath was talking about when we were putting this at the rights and responsibilities. There are things now that must be done in every school district. And is it happening? Depends. If they're keeping track and they're collecting this data. It also goes on to talk about that the board is actually looking at disproportionality. That's part of the first or second bullet somewhere. And Vice President Farah, that's the part I think you were getting back to the comment of due process. It really is, where is it in this policy that we're making sure that we as a board are addressing disproportionality if it's happening, and it's clearly stated in that first area when it talks about exclusion, right? In addition to discipline, and I think that's back to Director Marville, you're talking about the different types of them. There are ones that we have state law that say this is the discipline for this.
Sure.
Right? Whether it be weapon or those kinds of things. We still, by the way, do a threat assessment for those.
Yep.
Because we want to know what that. But it's, yes, and to answer your question, no, it does not, because there are still those different types of things that happen to redirect behavior. That's the way I'll put that. That doesn't lead to exclusion.
Okay.
So can I ask a follow-up? Now, this is probably, I should have asked that first. Because at the beginning, Ms. Haller, you said something, this was related to RCW about restorative approach to something. But what I'm noticing is it's not spelled out like that. I know it's probably RCW, but it's not at the beginning. I think it should be a good introductory thing that talks about restorative approach. Because I know a lot of times when I talk to people about restorative approach to discipline, they're like, oh, so we're not disciplining kids. No, that's not what that means. And I'm wondering if this needs a preamble or something that talks about the restorative approach, because I don't necessarily see that there.
It is completely explained in procedure in a detailed form. So remember, procedure is how we go about what is in policy and how we explain it greater. And that's why the whole appeal process isn't in the policy, it's in our procedures.
But if it's a state law, I would love to see that statement, because if it's a law, it has to be a policy, right? I would love to see that preamble or something there, because I think that would help a little bit with that. That way we know that we're taking restorative. But again, if I'm a person just who doesn't understand and I'm looking at this policy, I'm like, wow, it doesn't really talk about what this is. I would love to see that there.
Well, so, all right, good evening. President Clark, directors of the board, and
Supposed to be all of that. Don't worry
knew
about
I was
that.
screwing that up.
Please don't worry about
turn
that.
it. Superintendent Bella. So in the procedure, it does outline that before you do any form of discipline, you must, as a teacher, try something that is reflective, instructional, or restorative. That is not something that's outlined within the policy, but it is language that is used throughout the procedure.
I hear you, but I want it in, I want that statement in this policy, even though it's in the procedure, because I want our policy to say that we take a restorative approach. Because procedure is procedure, but policy, that's where it starts, right? And so I want to see it in here that we do that. And if it's a state law, and we've said at previous meetings that if it's a law, we have to adopt it, right? And so if that's the case, I don't want to nickel and dime which ones we put in and which ones we don't. Because there's several meetings we've said, oh, that doesn't need to be in the procedure, that's just policy. Oh, that doesn't need to be in the policy, that's procedure. So I get a little confused because if I want it, as board directors, if we want it in the procedure, it needs to be in the policy.
Policy
So
drives.
Policy drives. So if I want us to say we take a restorative approach, that needs to be in the policy.
Yeah.
It's great that it's in the procedure.
Yeah.
Unless I'm wrong about my role, but I feel like
No,
that's
Oh, no, I think what I hear you saying,
Yeah.
and I'm going to offer to the board as a whole, the legal references is at the bottom there. Do any of those legal references refer to restorative practices? It would be a question. We've often cross-referenced there because that is the law. I think that's what you're getting at. But I want to make sure that's
Yes,
clear.
but yes, I agree, because I always want things cross-referenced for ease of use. But if we're gonna say that our disciplinary practices in this district are restorative, then in the discipline policy, we probably should say, because I searched this whole document, there's nothing in here that says anything about.
Restorative,
I think where we're thrown a little bit is usually WASDA, when it is law, puts it in for us to make sure that it's in there. It sounds like, for whatever reason, WASDA did not put that in there. However, the point you make, I think, is valid, and we should probably go back and put that in if that is what is there.
That's
So,
my preference, but
yeah.
if my colleagues agree with me. But I'm also going to point out that I don't necessarily believe that we just adopt things from WASDA just because they say. Like, we could put our own spin and our own things to it. And I'm
I want
okay
to
with that.
just to clarify, I wasn't saying just cross-reference it there, because as you've noticed, many of the policies that you approve actually cross-reference right in the middle of the in the
Right.
content.
Yes.
Yep. So that's what I was stating.
Right.
Let's get that cross-reference exactly how it says it. Now, there's no misconception, but I would leave it to the board to, come to consensus on that.
Well, it seems like when the second sentence in the introductory paragraph, discipline is not necessarily punitive, but can take positive and supportive forms. When we're describing
Sure.
how we do our discipline, that seems like that's exactly the right place to state how we do discipline. We do it in restored, we
Yeah.
have restored.
Might be a
I
good
agree.
spot to
I like that.
cross-reference.
Right.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to say this for the record, is that when we're saying, discipline and disproportionality and all of that, we're not trying to handcuff the principals and the teachers who are actually the ones that are really in front of that child and understand the situation better than any of us sitting here. I just want to make sure that as a district that we're aware of it and that we will have to have rules or steps to make sure that those cases where it happens, mistakes happen, there is a way that we can then go back and make sure that we correct. So that's the whole premise. I just wanted to put that word in there, due process.
And that's why I still don't understand, and I appreciate that everybody's tried to address this to me. I still don't understand on section 5, where it says, deprive a student of a student's right of an equal educational opportunity. To me, equal educational opportunity could be something as simple as, you don't get to go to an assembly. You don't get to go to a field trip. You don't get to go to whatever it is because you're in
Restricted.
right? Whatever that is,
Right.
without a due process of law. And I feel like that could easily be used to handcuff principals and teachers from being able to do something that is an appropriate response to inappropriate behavior. And
I agree.
I think that's
tot-
totally different
I
than
agree.
suspension.
And the thing I wanted to also point out is, we're human,
Yeah,
happens.
Yeah, we can.
Principals make mistakes.
yep.
Teachers make mistakes.
Yeah.
So we need to have a process where, when that happens, there is a way.
And I hope that there's-
All of it. I
Right,
don't
right.
think that they're exclusive.
Exactly.
And I hope there's regular training too, because
Exactly.
the restorative approach is different than just disciplinary approach. And so I'm hoping that there's training that
Right.
that the schools provide for their new staff who may not be familiar with that.
Is there any way we can put that in either policy or somewhere that maybe, I don't know, training, sensitive training on how to handle all of those things?
Again,
I think that there's procedures, we've
different
read about
ways.
it.
Procedure, okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but still, I'm sorry, can I go back to it again? 5?
Yes.
Go for it.
Yes.
I still don't see how it does not take away appropriate discipline. And again, this is totally different than suspension. But even the educational opportunity, that's such a broad statement. How is detention not, because that could be an equal educational opportunity. Making it so that anybody who doesn't like that they got that, saying, I want due process of law.
Right. And I think it comes down to how we're defining due process in some. So with the suspension, the state has come back and said, this is the specific things we want you to do.
Yes.
In the other ones below the level of a suspension, they give flexibility in. And that could be as simple as the adult asking the student, what's your side of the story? And what is and that's a regular practice. I mean, it doesn't happen very often. I won't say it never happens because I'm not in every space in our district at all times. But where a kid is just a disciplinary action was assigned without the adult asking their side of the story. That is just kind of a normal thing that happens. And in the lower level pieces, there is no provision to this can't be implemented until all this is done. A lot of times the appeal that happen with things that are lower than a suspension actually come after the case, and the parent is simply wanting to make sure that it is not on the student's permanent record. And so there's sometimes an appeal process that happens after the discipline has already been administered, and then the parent says, whoa, I think you didn't do that right. We go through the process and then we say, yeah, you're right, maybe we missed something, and so this won't be on the student's discipline. We will make sure that it's not on their record. And that happens too.
Can I ask a follow-up to that?
Yeah.
So, being in the classroom for all these years, I have an idea. So if I taught a Spanish class, for instance, and I didn't like students popping their gum or chewing gum and I kicked them out every day, for me, that's excluding them from their educational
yeah.
environment. I can have that rule that could be annoying, but I can't exclude that student. Am I correct? Even if it's a rule, one of my classroom rules.
Right.
Yeah.
It wouldn't necessarily be an okay rule, but we'd have some sort of restorative conversation about, hey, when you chew gum in class, that's really distracting.
Yeah.
That's different than get out.
Yeah. And now, there are some provisions around educators that are in state law that allows them to exclude a child from their classroom, and that
But not chewing gum and
Well,
bringing
I
a
mean,
pencil
it's
or.
not meant to do that. It's supposed to be a material, like a substance disruption.
Yeah.
And then that is one of those things that the new state discipline codes came in, and those were used to kind of be called phantom suspensions, which is they were sent out, there was no record of it, and parents were never notified of it.
Yeah.
So the new law actually says when a student is excluded by a teacher from a classroom, which is a right that a teacher has in this state, then that it has to be documented, and the parent needs to be informed. And that was a big change in practice that actually has helped tremendously, because giving parents that knowledge, then now they're like, hey, this is happening every day in this teacher's classroom, and then it really gets a chance for us to understand. And then, for administration to step in and say, seriously, like you're sending kids out every day for chewing their gum? And then that becomes a different conversation. So, yeah.
So then the due process is defined in the procedures of what the due process of law is.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, and then the other piece, if I may, that the gaps that are referenced in the gap that exists would be when we're excluding a student from the educational process. In other words, if anytime that we're keeping that child from learning, or in a setting that they're learning, that's a problem. And make sure that you're following the policy, more importantly, the procedure on how you do it. That's the how. And so I think all I'm trying to say here is what's the why behind this? The why is to make sure that we're not growing a gap in a student's education from a disproportionate standpoint because I haven't done these things. That's really what I wanted to summarize. Right. And I don't believe, Director Margot, that this does tie their hands. I think the procedure really does support, I think, the new laws that are continually come out. But I wanted to come back to, because I want to make sure we get this in there. I think it was Director Benno mentioned, let's cross-reference or get the restorative piece with the WAC.
Both.
With the actual laws.
Yes. That'd be awesome.
That's in there. And I want to make sure, turn it back over to Ms. Howley to make sure you capture that according to how the board is kind of, because I don't want to leave this conversation without seeing the language.
I also have another question that's going to annoy people, but I'm going to get to that in a second.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to work with Ms. Simpson and Ms. Whitlock, and we'll get the language in there. If we put the language in about restorative practices, can we bring this to the board on the 22nd, I believe it is? And if the language isn't what you like, we don't move it forward. The board votes it down. But if it is, we can move another policy forward with that language in. Are you good with that?
Yes. Minus what I'm going to say is going to be annoying.
The language and the WAC.
Yes.
Right, okay, got it.
Okay, so at a previous meeting, and I'm going to hide behind my book, we were talking about discipline and recess. And that's not in here that I see.
We knew that was coming, and it's in procedure, so hang on just a second.
Director Benno, you do not have to hide behind the book.
Remember that.
I can see.
I think we should start having recess on the board.
We've actually done a lot of work on this one. We had a committee with teachers and with KEA and with principals, all discussing and proposing language. And beyond that, we ended up going to elementary schools and doing some listening sessions with students to get their feedback around language. And I also went to PTA, got feedback from PTA, as well as connecting with our community-based organizations and getting feedback from them. I did propose new language to be put in the procedure, and I can read that language.
Yeah, because we don't have procedures in our documents, so that would be great if you can show it or read it to us.
Right.
Well, so we started by defining what recess is. So recess is a recurring scheduled period of time on a school's master calendar in which students have a break from the classroom instruction and are given a choice in activity within school and safety parameters. The activities a student participates in during recess may be on the playground, classroom, or in another location in the school. Then you'll see the language that was in the other policy. Recess will not be withheld for the purpose of punishment. Example, owing 5 recesses as detention. In parentheses. Restorative, reflective, and instructional activities are not considered to be punishment. Then we went into providing some opportunities to do alternative types of activities during learning. This was something that was really important to KEA because of students who want to do tutoring or students who want to work in the library. It was also important to students that they have choice and don't have those activities taken away. So for students who have alternative types of recess activities, such as peer tutoring or leadership, they can maintain the ability to choose this activity instead of outdoor recess when staff is available to support. Then, I'm going to say this surprised me because our students were very passionate about some of those extreme circumstances that may take place, and parents also were aligned with us. When there's an extreme circumstance, then we should be able to take away a recess, such as a kid just punched another kid. They shouldn't have to go right onto the playground together. So there are circumstances in which a recess with peers can be taken away from an individual student. These types of behaviors include, but are not limited to, physically aggressive behavior. If a student's presence creates an impact on others, making students feel unsafe, the student may be provided with activities in lieu of recess for the day. If a student has just engaged in a behavior in which they need to de-escalate, staff will need the opportunity to calm the student prior to releasing them to recess. Staff will aim to provide all students with opportunities to move their bodies, examples, walking breaks, alternative recess, etc., even if an emergent situation occurs. This was something that a couple of the elementary students actually came and spoke individually with me about, is even if I have recess taken away, I still really want to move my body somehow or have a break. If a student has recess taken away due to behaviors, staff will provide the student with an alternative time or location to move their body. During recess time, the student may be engaged in activities that are restorative, reflective, or instructional. If a student's entire recess is taken away due to engaging in significant behaviors, parents or guardians will be notified.
That makes me very happy.
Really happy.
I appreciate all the big brains that went into that to make that happen.
May I ask a clarifying question on this?
Yes.
Examples I've seen before is a class that will not stop talking, let's say. And so you just took up 5 minutes of the class's time because you guys were talking. I'm taking 5 minutes away from your recess. It says very specifically in there that this is, and by the way, let me say that I'm not saying that I've observed this in Kent School District recently. I have, this is purely an example base. That does not sound like that would qualify, taking away recess from an entire classroom, because it sounds like it's very specific to a particular student for particular behavior.
We did make it specific to specific students within this language. That was something I will say that parents were adamant about, as well as students, that it was not fair to punish the whole for what typically is 1 or 2 students.
Just for point of clarification, and I should know this, but do we have a designated time for recess?
Every school has designated times. I believe they have, I think they're 15-minute periods in 2 or 3 a day.
Right.
Does the district have an overall
I think every
amount?
They're all different, so their schedules,
Right.
calendars, and their schedules have different start times.
Yeah, I know
and
that, but I
So
mean,
that would be a different
I'm saying,
time.
do they have a total per school that they have to meet on recess?
Like some schools could have 3 recesses and some would only have
Got it.
2, or
Right,
5
you're
and this one has
absolutely
40.
right. That I don't know.
Yeah.
we have a policy
We're
about
only
that?
talking about elementary, obviously,
Yes.
here. And so we can come back with you to that, on that.
Because they're getting ready to change that time frame.
Yeah, we'll come back with that. I think what I hear you, thank you for clarifying.
Yes.
That, 2 things. One, do they have the same amount of recesses?
Yep,
Secondly, the time of the
Of the recesses,
recesses. That I heard you say as well.
yeah,
So
because
we'll
they're
come
getting
back
ready
to
to change that statewide
Yep.
too, I think, so, yeah.
And I'm sure that's related to that, because I think I might have seen that come through on minutes.
Yep.
And all of those pieces, so, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
And I wanted to say, thank you, Director Bennell, for bringing that up.
It was in my notes, because when I read these things, I'm like, oh yeah, we talked about this.
Oh, we did,
so-
and the reason I say it's a sincere
don't
thank
have to
you
hype
in
it.
that we have in the past.
Right.
Remember, we had conversation,
We did.
and that's why I really appreciate
did,
about our
yeah.
board is, we had the conversation,
Yeah.
and my team went back, and I just want to commend them. Thank you,
That-
Sherry,
Yeah,
Susie.
we
Very
really
much.
appreciate that.
Because that process started
Yeah.
with us talking about this,
Right.
and.
I'd love to see it.
It's great, so thank you for bringing it up.
I just appreciate the thoroughness of the
Yes.
voices that was heard in that.
Right.
Because there's a lot of stakeholders. And as a parent of an elementary school kid, it might be the only thing I hear about the entire day. And it means a lot to our kids.
Right.
Yeah, so, thank you.
Okay, we're moving on to policy 1220, board officers and duties of board members. This is a second reading. I know some of the questions were about media versus social media, and the president speaking on behalf of the board to media and general public. I know that Sandy Hayes from WASDA addressed some of the questions about this during the retreat. Director Hamada commented that under duties of individual board members, the authority of individual board member is limited to participating in actions taken by the board as a whole legally in session. That does not stop board directors from communicating with their public. She also mentioned that on the third paragraph, the president will be the official recipient of correspondence directed to the board and will provide that needed clarification as if email is sent to individual board members listing their names, they have the right to respond to constituents in their district. In other words, it is the duty of the president to respond to all emails, yes, but that does not stop with other board directors from communicating with their constituents. She wanted clarification there. Any other comments?
As a reminder, staff went back, took the language, and included what you just heard. And so that's,
Anything else? Board, are we good to move on?
Yes.
Okay.
I believe.
Do I hear you saying, maybe I need to be more directed, you're going to keep the language as is, or there will be any more, you're going to clarify a little bit of my questions on that, or what?
As it is now, you had mentioned you wanted clarification. I believe that it's clarified in here, but if you wanted other language actually added, we could talk about that.
I mean, does anybody else have any questions about your ability to speak or write emails to your constituents?
I'm glad for the clarification, because it almost sounded like last time that we weren't allowed. That's why I had a lot of concern. So I'm glad that clarification was made.
no, thank you. Director Bennett, I recall that, and I remember saying, you can. However, let's take staff to come back with the language, and this is the clarification that we came back with.
Good?
I thought I had a question, but I can't find, I can't find in my notes, but I'm good. If I have a concern, I'll bring it up at our board meeting.
Right.
But I can't remember what it was.
Absolutely.
Right, right.
Absolutely.
Which is, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, we are on to 4220. This is back as a third reading. Let me pull it up.
I remember this.
The policy has been revised to specifically note various other complaint processes. Director Beno, you wanted that in particular, and the board agreed with you. We mentioned in there such as employee complaint against another employee. I added a ton of links in here and definitions and cross-references. So let me show it to you in its final form. The legal references are in there, the cross-references for different types of policies that we have that have to do with complaints are noted in there. And Director Hamada asked at the end, the last sentence, resolution will be determined by the superintendent's contract. And she asked, are we saying that we do not get the opportunity to that they do not get the opportunity to bring their complaints to the board? It actually says in that last paragraph, complaints against the superintendent should be directed to the Kent School District Board of Directors as the employer of the superintendent. Resolution will be determined by the superintendent's contract.
But I don't understand what that means then. You're saying two things.
So I will, I want to sure I got the question. You're not,
I understand, I mean, you kept in what we fought for before, that if every avenue had been taken, and they still had an issue with the superintendent, that you could bring it to the board, which I appreciate, in which we really worked through another board and came to a 5-0 to add that, which was never there. But then it says the resolution will be determined by the superintendent's contract. What does that mean? The resolution is the answer to anything brought about the superintendent, or the board is going to be able to see that?
thank you. I just wanted to get clarification.
Yeah, I don't get that.
I'll have Mr. Brockwell come to this.
Thank you, members of the board, Superintendent Vela, Madam Clerk. The question is what to do with a complaint that is leveled against the superintendent, and the answer is not necessarily found in a policy, because you have a contract that requires his performance to be reviewed in executive session. So we may be dancing on the head of a pin a little bit. It's functionally the same thing. It will come to you, but it will come to you under Section 4 of the superintendent's contract, not as a matter of policy.
I don't understand what that means, Paul.
Well, you entered into a contract with the superintendent.
Right.
And it requires you to communicate with the superintendent board as a group and have discussions about any major issues, complaints, and so forth. And in the contract, he is allowed to be in executive session and talk about his performance in executive session.
Right.
And that's what is intended by that language, that it comes to you and it's handled under your contract. Those discussions are in private, behind closed doors, and it is not necessarily an appeal to the board under a policy. It is handled under the contract. That's why I say it may be a distinction without a difference. It's still coming to you. They can come to you, and you have a process in the contract that you got to follow.
I still have a problem with it. I guess when we did this before, are you saying that when it came across before and our public was asking us to be able to, at some point, to be able to address our superintendent? And I don't want to go in the back issues or.
No, I get it, yeah.
I don't want to really bring all that up.
Right.
So we really came together, even as kind of a distinct difference of opinion board, that we wanted something for our public to be able to take it to us. So are you saying in the former superintendent's contract, he didn't have that in his contract?
I don't think he did. I don't think that there was specific avenue for or provision for handling complaints in the contract. That was negotiated by the board and with the superintendent.
And this contract absolutely says how we're going to handle that then?
Well, it doesn't go down to the gnat's teeth on that. It doesn't say what process is given, what kind of testimony is considered, documents and so forth. In general terms, it requires the board to consider work performance issues that are brought before it in executive session and allow the superintendent an opportunity to respond. And in many respects, it's very similar to a hearing that you might hear in executive session. That's why I say it may be a distinction without a difference. The board still can hear it. It's not like you have to shut your ears, nor would anybody want you to. The public needs to be able to talk to you, and you need to be able to respond to the public by providing oversight to the superintendent, your one employee. It's just handled in the contract versus the policy.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Sure. So it says complaints against the superintendent shall be directed. So I don't see the policy in front of me. So is that similar as other complaints? I'm just not.
Finish your sentence there,
So it
Joe.
says, so it says complaints against the superintendent should be directed. And my question is, what's that process for filing that complaint? Is it the same as the other complaints? N 4220?
But finish your sentence, shall be directed.
Oh, it should be directed to the Kent School Board of Directors as employer, superintendent, et cetera.
Yeah, it's different in that the other complaints against staff, for example, are filed with the superintendent.
Oh.
And he takes care of the staff, you take care of him.
But how does, if you're a community member and you have a complaint against the superintendent, how do you do that?
Yeah, that's my question.
Oh, okay.
How does it come to us? What's that process? Because I don't see the procedure in front of me, so I don't know what that looks like.
Yeah, I can't speak that right now, but it may or may not say that, but generally.
Well, the procedure is it goes through the contract.
Well,
That's part of it.
But the very,
Right, how does
I'm
it
a
happen?
community member.
How did that happen? Yeah.
What do I do next?
What do I do?
I think what it's going to say is that it goes to the board president, the president brings to the, goes in executive
In what
session.
form?
So they just write me an email or
Exactly.
Tim an email and say,
So if I may,
Right.
so not a complicated process. It would be in the procedure. It could be currently the way that is, so an employee could bring an email, and the process would be following the 4220, that email is attached to it. So we can't ignore it. It's still a complaint. You couldn't ignore it, whether it was an email or whatever, but the procedure can be aligned to this, is what I'm saying. It can be an email, it can be a process that we put in place, but the language itself is what we added based on Director Hamada's comments from the last time to include those pieces.
Which I agree, but like if the process, if because we can't see the procedure, if it hasn't been created yet, then we don't know what that looks like.
If I can,
Go ahead.
from prior experience, as we work towards the superintendent's evaluation, there is a long list of things that basically need to be identified, and consequently, we as a governing board pass judgment. Now, we may differ individually, but if creatively we come to a conclusion, we are failing on this point, and we give notice that this needs to be corrected by such and such a date, he now becomes, in that particular thing, vulnerable because we had a laundry list of things that were expectations. Most of them are fairly simple. Communicate with the community in terms of a financial plan and its ramifications for the coming school year, so there are no surprises, for argument's sake. Okay, so your process of eventually getting to the point of talking about a renewal of the contract has all those weighted measures already built into it, so.
But not a form to file a complaint. Like, I agree with you on all that, yes, but not specifically this one thing that has a little to do with the contract, but specifically this complaint. Like, I guess that's my confusion.
I'd like to speak first, please. An evaluation, to me, is totally separate than a parent or somebody that has an immediate concern that they've gone through the chain of command and it hasn't worked, and they've even appealed to the superintendent. This is about a specific issue. This isn't over overall evaluation, that they have somebody that they can go to if they really feel like they have been wronged on one issue. It doesn't mean what they're doing all year long. Evaluation is totally separate than this.
So there are two, let's just say you're talking about a staff member and not Israel, the superintendent. The appeals process under the current proposed policy would end at Israel, and you would not have the appellate right.
So if I may, just respectfully, let's use superintendent,
Right.
because that's the policy. It's not a name.
Not you, yes. It's
Right,
yes.
and, because I wanted to keep it at that.
Yes, absolutely.
And what I was going to say was to answer the question, Director Margell and Benno, about how currently there is a form that leaves it open to who that is. And it already has, as you know, been used for board, really anybody. And that's the how. That's the answer to the how. What I can do with my team and also with support from our general counsel is, should we keep the same form? Because it still needs to be directed to the board according to this language. Could do that. It's the same process.
Yeah.
So, but Director Bennett, I just wanted to share that.
That makes sense. So yeah, that's what I was looking
that's
for.
what
That
you
makes
were
more
getting at.
sense.
Yes.
Yes.
I apologize. I thought I heard you correctly, but I had to go back.
You know,
to
sometimes
it.
I just ramble, and so I keep coming back to the point.
We have a form.
Yeah, that makes sense. It makes
We have a
sense.
form, and what that means is that then that form goes to, to the board.
Yes.
That's right.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think that's what Director Bernard was talking
Yeah.
about.
Thank you.
And the procedure can have that information right in there.
Any other?
I'm still a little wishy-washy about why was added. The resolution will be determined by the superintendent's contract. I'll think on it.
Okay.
Well, because we have to. I mean, we have a contract.
Right.
I understand that. But why is it in here?
I think the risk is if you can contradict the contract, then you set yourself up inadvertently for a breach of your own contract.
Yeah.
I think I probably should have known that before I looked at this contract a little more closely, though. Yeah.
Well, the contract also says you work collaboratively with the superintendent and all sorts of general ideas.
Yeah, and I agree with all that.
And I'd also ask respectfully, let's keep to the policy and not a conversation of that contract at this point.
Right. It's just thrown in here.
I understand why it's in there, but it seems kind of random. But I understand. But I think I need to think on that too.
I think we had a conversation when we were, I mean, I don't want to go back, but we had a conversation about the contract. And we were talking about how are we going to collaborate with the superintendent and how we're going to do that. So we wanted to put the wording in there so that we're not going to handicap or chain the hands of the superintendent. And that's what has happened in the past, and we were just trying to avoid that. That's why I believe we added those clauses in the contract.
Yeah, I'm remembering the conversation.
Right.
So
Right. Now that, So.
thank you for clarifying.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, board, we're on to the last policy for the evening. You're back to the fourth reading of 5271. It's our whistleblower policy. Just a background for anybody who's watching, the consensus at the January 4th policy work session was to move this to approval. The board then tabled this policy at the January 25th regular meeting. It came back February 1st. We have it again tonight for a fourth reading. The board had several issues they wanted addressed, and I think it's all been captured in this policy now. They wanted it, the board, you wanted it noted that the policy is to be used for more grave action, in which that language is in here. The board wanted cross-references included to other policies and procedures, which has also been done in here. Additionally, the statement was added, notice will be given to the board regarding this action. Definition links were included, as Director Benno and the board agreed upon. And so when you look at it in its final format, all of those things the board was requesting have been included in here. Definitions, cross-references, the notice that the board would be given, notice would be given to the board regarding this action is included in here. So everything the board requested has been included in this policy.
One thing I believe I brought up last time was around notice and timeliness, and just at least having the word timely notice.
Notice to the board, is that what you're saying?
Yep,
Timely
notice will be given to the board regarding this action,
I'm sorry, I missed that. I can say timely notice will be given to the board,
please.
okay?
Yes.
Oops. Anything else?
And, Ms. Holly, I made note on here that the following language added after the governmental actions and infractions of KSD. What exactly did it mean? Was that added? And I don't even know.
I'm sorry, will you say it again?
I don't know what I was talking about. This was the one I did a while ago, but I made a note to here that I wanted the following language added after governmental actions.
In accordance with this policy and related procedure?
And you added that then, right?
Yes.
I'm
Okay.
not sure it was added second time, possibly.
It's right
Yeah,
there,
it was
Established
prior.
procedure,
Yeah,
But I don't, maybe I'm looking at.
it's there.
It
Okay.
is there, yeah.
I'm looking at
Second
a different
paragraph.
copy then,
Right,
okay.
right.
All right, thank you.
Sure. We good on this one to move it forward?
Finally.
Yes. Finally,
A lot of work, a
exactly.
lot of
I
work.
don't want a fifth.
It'll go on as fifth reading.
No, thanks.
And to be determined.
Hey,
I know.
This is the glamorous
You know what?
work of the board,
But I
y'all.
say-
Would do it right.
Glamorous.
And I tell you this, it is really important that we
Yes.
always have these debates because
Yeah.
this matters.
It does.
Exactly.
I'm paraphrasing Director Margell, who said boilers aren't sexy, but they're necessary. And,
That's
you know,
True.
Of all things to be quoted on.
yep, there you go.
I just wanted to say, President Clark and members of my board, that this is really great. And yes, it was a fifth reading. However, when we take a look at the successes we've had in all the policies, if you look at second, third, fourth, or fifth readings, there isn't like a number that says, oh, you have to six, because remember, we had that conversation.
Yeah.
That was the second reading, we got to pass. No, you don't.
No, it isn't.
Yeah, the board works collectively
Right.
until they're comfortable with. And if it takes us to go back, my team will go back.
Right.
And you noticed today, we listened and we went back to try to include that language. And there's no way we could have done that unless we had that communication here at the dais. So, thank you.
Thank you.
With that, we're done.
Wow.
Clark.
And
Thank you, everyone.
now for my speech.
Oh,
Joe, I just wanted to compliment you on the reality is, I also agree with you. We don't have to word for word agree with WASDA. It is, in fact, this board making decisions about how this district should be run. So I just want to acknowledge that. And I
you.
want to congratulate the board on the process that we have undertaken and clearly done something with that. And with that, it's 6:42, we're adjourned.
Great
thank
job.
you.